Hi, this is Brett with Piano Aha, and in this video we want to talk again about Bach's Prelude in C major, this time the right hand. Now you might ask yourself, what is the best way to learn the right hand of this piece? And I would say that's a question we don't need to answer. There's no best way. In the same way, if you're at point A and you want to get to point B, for example, let's say you're in California and you want to go to New York, there might be a shortest way, there might be a fastest way, and they're not necessarily the same, and there might be the scenic route as well, right? There are different ways. Same thing with a piece. Depending on your previous knowledge and the goal you're trying to accomplish, you might want to learn it in a different way. In this video, we want to talk about how you would learn the right hand of this piece with the least amount of knowledge and just to be able to play the piece at all. So we're not talking about memorizing the piece or doing a harmonic analysis of it. So this least amount of knowledge, I would say, is you need to know where middle C is, you need to know what the lines and spaces mean, how to read up and down at the piano, and what a sharp and a flat do. If you don't know these things, I'm sure there will be a link in the description, and if you do, then let's get started. So the principle that we're going to use to learn the right hand of this piece in this video is what you could call relative reading. We're going to use the notes from one measure to help us find the notes in the next measure. And maybe the best way to jump into this way of thinking is starting not with measure 1, but with measure 21. So we see here that the middle note is just middle C, which you know, and we have a line below and a line above. So we're dealing with these notes here. And as you know, this actually sounds like this, but we're just going to play all of these at one time for us now, just so we know which notes we actually have to find. So what we want to do is compare this measure with the next measure and see what changes. So we see the lower note stays the same, the middle note stays the same, and the upper note just gets a flat. So now we're dealing with these notes. Moving to the next measure, we again see that the middle note is the same, and the outer two notes just move toward each other, giving us a bit of a scale here. And here we see that the upper note on this space here is still the upper note in the next measure, and below that we have another space and another space. So that must be these notes here. Now you might notice I'm playing this in a bit of a strange way with my fingers here. I'm just doing this so that you can see what notes I'm playing. So starting here, we see that this lower note actually stays the same for quite a long time. Now the upper two notes here that were on spaces just go up one. They go to lines. And now the upper note is the only one that changes. It just goes up one. And now to measure 27, we see that only the middle note changes, etc. And so we can learn this entire piece by using this way of thinking.
Now you might be wondering why we began in measure 21, not in measure 1. Well, in measure 21, it's very easy to find this chord because we have middle C right in the middle. And the changes between the measure are very slight in these cases. So it's simple to know how to find the next measure. Now, we can do the same sort of thinking from the beginning. It's just a little bit more complex than here. So let's start at the beginning. How could we find this chord? Well, we know that middle C would be here on the first ledger line. That would be here. And then we'd have the next note here on this line. So that must be here, right? Just thinking of every second key. Now if we had only lines here, line, 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 then we would have something like this. But indeed we have two spaces, so these upper two notes are just a little bit higher. So that's the beginning of our piece. Right? So let's start there. And why don't we just go through the entire piece and find at least one way of finding the next measure. Sometimes there might be 2 or 3 good ways of doing it, but you only need one. Okay, so we're beginning here. How can we find the next measure? Well, as it turns out, if you look closely, everything just goes up one. So as we were here, now we are here. Now, compare between these two measures. Well, the upper notes are still on the lines, right? The only thing that changes is the lower note. Just goes down one, which gives us that. And here, you could either, for example, just recognize, oh, that's the same thing as the beginning, and just know, okay, that must be that. Or you could see the upper two notes were on lines and they go down to the spaces. Starting here, there are a couple of passages that look maybe more difficult than they are. For example, here, if you look at each one of these three notes and try to find each one of these three notes, you might think, oh, the way that these notes jump from one to another is not so simple. But there are a couple of good ideas of dealing with that. For example, let's just look at the lower note. The lower note just goes up one, right? So I have that here. And the highest note remains just as the middle note, right? Which gives us that. And now we're home free. So if this next note were also in a space, it would be here. But as it turns out, it's on a line a little bit higher. So we have that there. Now, how might we find the notes in this next measure? Well, one way of going about it would be to say, this lower note here just turns into the middle note. So I have that. And I have a space below, and let's say a space above. And that would give me that. That's just slightly incorrect, right? Instead of the space above, I have actually a line above, which gives me these notes here, and the lower one gets a sharp. Again, it's always a good trick to first read the lines and the spaces, and then worry about the sharps or the flats later. So that gives us that. Again here, you might think, oh, there are lots of jumps. Just read the lowest note. The lowest note just goes up one. Right? So we just slide up to the next note, and the upper note remains as the middle note. And again, if we had another line, we would just have this here. Turns out we have a space a little higher, so that gives us that. And as we continue, we can use the same trick we used before. The lowest note here just turns into the middle note. And then below that we have a line, and above that we have a little bit higher than what would be a line, which gives you that. Now at this point, it's very important to compare. Reading across the lines is never easy, but if you can do it, you realize that's the same thing. So you don't really need to do anything here. It's the exact same chord in the right hand. As we continue here, I would say a good way of reading this would be to recognize that the top note stays the same and the lower two just go down one. And then, as I said, at the end, don't forget to add your sharps or flats. Here, again, we have a common tone. Whenever you have a common tone, you know that you have some valuable information in your hand that you don't want to lose. So don't overlook the fact that you get to leave one of your fingers there. And then you can just see, for example, here that those two notes just sort of go toward each other. So they go toward each other like that. Here again, across the line, we see that we have one note that stays the same. That's always valuable information. So the middle note is here on the line. This middle note is on the same line. So we keep those, and what happens to the other two notes? They actually both just go up. The line goes up to the space goes up to the line, and the line goes up to the space, right? They just go up one, like this. We were here, and now we're here. And as I said, just don't forget about the sharp. Now, what happens here? Again, you might think this is a complicated passage, because nothing stays the same. But if you look closely, there are a couple of interesting things that happen. For example, the upper two notes, they were on lines and spaces, and now it's just a space and a line. So the upper two notes just go up one, right? They go that way. And the lower note goes down. So if you just look at the outer two notes here, they just go away from each other. Here again, we have, for example, a common tone here. The lowest note stays the same. And what you could do here is just to think, I have this note already, since that's the same one. And then, first of all, I'll just think I have a space and a space and a space, which would give me that. But then just to realize that this highest note is actually just a little bit higher than being on a space. So we'll read that. Here, there will be different ways of reading it. You might read that the lower note goes down, or you might just say that that lowest note is middle C, which we know, right? And you could see that's on a line, and that is also on a line, just not on the next one, so that must be here. And either you recognize this note also as being a C, maybe you have that information at your hands, or you might say, well, if this were on a line, that would be here, it's just a little bit higher, so it must be like that. The next one I would read this way. I would say, well, the middle note is middle C. We know that. And then below it, we have a line below and almost a line above. So it's almost this, just a little bit higher. Again, here, very important to recognize, these are the same, that you don't need to read anything at all. Now, across the page is always difficult to compare. But we have here an upper note in the space, and then a couple lines, and here we have the same upper note in the space, and these two just go down one. Here I would say the upper two notes go together. Here I would say the upper two notes remain the same, that's important, and the lower note was on that space, and now it's on that space. So that gives us that just with a flat. And now we're approaching the place that we began, measure 21. We see that only the lower note is different. And as we said before, the upper note gets it flat, the outer notes move toward each other, the upper note stays the same and just with spaces below, the upper notes go up, only the upper note moves, here only the middle note moves. So here in measure 27, we've now reached the point that we were at the beginning. So now we have some new territory. What happens here? Well, I would ignore this sharp until the very end. Deal with the lines and the spaces first, as I've said. And you see that the lower two notes just go up one, right? And then at the end you have your sharp. So we have that. And here we have a note that stays the same. That's always a nice thing, as I said. And the outer two notes, so the lowest one and the highest one, they just go apart from each other. This one goes up and this one goes down. And again here it's important, reading across the line to see what actually changes. It's not much. Only the highest note here, the one on the line, actually changes. And now only the middle note changes. This is where this relative reading really proves itself when the measures are very similar. Here, again, read the flat at the end, deal with the lines and the spaces first. Only the upper note moves. And then at the end, of course, you add the flat. Okay, now the last line of the piece is a bit of an exception. It has a different structure than the rest of the piece. Be that as it may, we can still treat it the same way. We see that the upper note here just goes up a little bit, and the lower note just goes down, right? So that gives us our sort of a scaffolding for what we're about to build. Now, what's going on with the notes in the middle? Well, we have a line and a line and a line. So we just have these notes. That's enough for just knowing where the measure happens at all. But if you want all the rest of the details, you're also going to have to read that at the end we have some new notes. And it turns out that we have... Turns out that at this point, it's worth it to play this with a different finger so that you can get down there. And you see that they're all on lines. So the first note's here, we have a line, and a line, and a line. Right, so basically at the beginning we grabbed that, and now we're grabbing that. And this is an interesting place here. I said at the beginning, I said, well, we're going to find each measure by comparing it with the measure before. Now, if you try to compare this note with that, then you'll be comparing for quite a while. So how about we go about this a different way? We'll just recognize that this is the same note as this from the beginning of the piece. Or alternatively, you just think that, you know, middle C would be here, and then the note on the first line would be here, and this note would be here. So we're finding that actually by a somewhat different method, that is, by comparing it with either the beginning of the piece or with C itself. Again, we see line, 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 so that must be every second key. And here it turns out we can get until about that far, or we could even take the next note with us too. And now we have quite a large jump. That's another good situation where you can just say, well, it's not far from C, right? Just compare it with middle C, it's just one higher than C. This just jumps up a little bit. And how can we find the end? Well, the lower note is just one higher. And you think line, line, line. That almost gives you the right answer. And the high note is just a little bit higher than that.
So now perhaps you can get through the entire piece just using this relative reading. Although you might be asking yourself, wouldn't it be faster if I just knew what the names of all these notes were and the names of all these keys were? And the answer to that is yes, it would be. But for one thing, it might take a while until you have memorized all of the different notes and keys. And for a second thing, I would say it is an important and often unappreciated skill to be able to read relatively. Because if you're reading a new measure and you find yourself thinking, okay, that's a G, and that's a D, and that's an F, it might have been easier just to think, oh, it's just the same, except the thumb goes down one. So thank you for watching this video, and happy ahas.